Leader of the UKIP Group, Neil Hamilton.
It's quite clear that the policy of the American government is going to change in many respects as a result of the election of President Trump, not least in respect of policies on climate change. And Scott Pruitt, who's President Trump's nominee as head of the Environment Protection Agency in the United States, has already caused to be removed from the department's website the US commitment to the UN climate change negotiations. Now, given that the United States, China and India between them are responsible for more than half of the global CO2 emissions in the world, and China and India have not signed up to any absolute reduction in the level of those emissions, does it, regardless of one's views on whether man-made climate change is a reality or not, regardless of views on that, does it make sense for Britain and Wales in particular, which is responsible for only 0.05% of world CO2 emissions, to be saddled with a dear energy policy that is a millstone around the neck of manufacturing industry and industries like the steel industry in particular?
Well, I have to say, I look at the weight of evidence, and the weight of evidence is overwhelmingly in favour of showing that climate change is happening, and secondly, human activity is causing it either to happen or to be exacerbated as a result. Those people who claim otherwise are on a shaky scientific basis. I look at the weight of evidence, and it is quite clear to me, he will know, he was a lawyer once, he will know that it's the weight of evidence you have to look at, not select what you think best supports your argument when it flies in the face of scientific reality. It's right to say that China and India face challenges, but China is up to the challenge. China is investing heavily in alternative fuel sources. It knows it has a problem. Anybody who's been to Beijing and the big Chinese cities will know there's a problem there with air pollution. The Chinese government recognise this, which is why they are looking for those alternative fuel sources. They know that they cannot continue with the current situation, but while they are going in the right direction, my fear is that the US will go in the opposite direction, flying in the face of the weight of scientific evidence.
The First Minister sidestepped my question. My question is not to do with the argument about whether man-made climate change is a reality or not. My question relates to what difference does it make if we sign up to targets which are going to pose enormous costs upon us, not just in terms of costs for industry, but also on ordinary people. And after all, nearly a quarter of the households in Wales are in fuel poverty, spending more than 10% of their incomes on keeping themselves warm in the winter, for example. So this is a real burden on poor and vulnerable people. If it makes no difference to the outcome in terms of global emissions, why should we saddle ourselves with these enormous bills? China and India are not signed up to reducing the absolute level of their emissions. What they're signed up to is reducing energy intensity, but that has to take into account the extent to which they expect their economies will grow, and their economies are going to grow to a greater extent than they reduce their fuel intensity. So absolute emissions are actually likely to increase in India and China, and that makes the problem even worse, and we're the fools who are paying the bills.
Well, that view is only valid if you accept that you're happy to see environmental degradation. Happy to see air quality reduce. Happy to return to the days when, I think it was the River Irwell actually in Salford, that was literally flammable when a lit match was thrown into it. Happy to return to the days when the River Ogmore in my hometown would run different colours according to what had been thrown into the river upriver. Because the natural journey from moving away from seeing the climate change as important is to see the environment as unimportant as well. We know that those people who do not accept climate change is happening, many of them do not accept that there's a need for environmental regulation either, certainly at the extent that we see now. This is not something we can dismiss. We can't simply say, well, it's something we can just put to one side, nor do I accept that this is something that imposes cost. The reality is that I've heard him argue for more coal-fired power stations. The irony is rich in what he says. The coal would have to be imported. So there are issues of energy security as well. Should we not invest in wind power offshore? Should we not invest in tidal energy rather than over-relying on energy sources that have to be imported into Britain? So energy security and mitigating climate change, to me, run hand in hand.
The First Minister is refusing to address the issue behind my question. Wales is responsible for 0.05% of global CO2 emissions. CO2 is not a flammable gas, by the way, so what he said about the air quality in Peking is irrelevant. Sulphur emissions are completely different, and the argument about particulates in the air, everybody accepts. It was a government 60 years ago that introduced the Clean Air Act, and everybody is in favour of that. This is a totally different question. My point is that Wales is one of the poorest parts of Western Europe. We have nearly a quarter of our households in fuel poverty. They're having to spend hundreds and hundreds of pounds, which they can ill afford, every year, paying for our renewables obligations under EU directives. If the United States is now going to resile from commitments to reduce its own CO2 emissions, if China and India are not signed up to it anyway, what is the sense in us making an infinitesimal difference to the amount of CO2 emitted in the world, an obligation which is causing real harm and real poverty in households in Wales?
Yeah. I do not think that I said that the air in Beijing was flammable. I'm not sure that the hydrogen or indeed oxygen content is so high that the air would catch fire or even explode. I was referring to a particular river, the context of which is well known, and my concern is that those who say that climate change is unimportant quite often take the view that environmental regulation is a burden on industry. I do not accept that. But again, I come back to this point. The wind blows, it's free. The tide will be there as long as the moon is in the sky. There is a capital cost, of course, of putting in place the infrastructure to generate energy, but once that is in place, the generating costs are very low indeed. I don't know what his alternative is. He hasn't outlined it. He talks of coal. He did his best to wreck the coal industry. The reality is that we will never produce enough coal in the UK now to supply our energy needs. We would have to import it from countries like Australia. We would have to import natural gas from countries that are not looking to do us a favour. We would have to import more liquid natural gas from countries around the world. We do that already. Now, whilst I know the energy mix in the UK is going to continue in the future, and indeed 25% of the liquid natural gas in the UK comes through Milford Haven, and that is something that will continue in the future. But I do not see the wisdom in saying what we need to do is to go back to the technology of yesterday with the pollution of yesterday and look to ignore the overwhelming weight of scientific evidence and put our heads in the sand. He is somebody who is proud, he says, to be British. Then let him display his pride then by saying he wants the UK to lead the way when it comes to dealing with climate change.
Question.